So let's talk about Module 2, which in my mind is pretty much the most important module in the entire course, but you may have other opinions. The idea of service level objectives was mentioned a few times in Module 1. This module will go into the details of what service level objectives, or SLOs, are, and some amount of information about how to set them up and how to use them. And a companion idea or tool, in effect, is something called air budgets. In fact, air budget policies as well will be covered in this module. The reason I think this is the most important module and the most important concept that distinguishes the site reliability engineering practices is the fact that everything is managed to SLOs. If you're doing the SRE practice properly, then SLOs are, top of mind throughout all of your activities because you're trying to meet those objectives with everything that you're doing. So let's get into it. This is the syllabus for the module. Again, we're talking about service level objectives and air budgets, SLOs, as well as the policies that go together with those air budgets, so that'll be explained. The structure for the module is the same as all the other modules in this course. There's a video. Again, it's a video from Google in this case. Again, it's Liz and Seth talking about risks and air budgets in this case. There's also a case story, which is there's actually two in this module, the Evernote case, as well as Home Depot. Both are pretty interesting to help explain this idea of SLOs and air budgets. The discussion will center around enforcing availability SLOs. Like I mentioned before, there are various kinds of reliability targets, and availability tends to be the most important one, so that's a good one to talk about in some depth. And there'll be an exercise to think about, what are the SLOs you might want to have for your own organization, and generally how would you go about determining what the SLOs are for your applications or your organization. So a little bit of how-to in that context. So what are SLOs? SLOs, as the name said, is a service level objectives. A service level objective is an objective. In other words, it's a goal. And in particular, it's a goal for how well a product or service should operate. It's intended to, to be something that customers care about. SLOs are really completely tied to a client's user experience. That doesn't mean it's necessarily the end client that's paying money. It could be some internal client or a stakeholder that uses a service, but certainly, SLOs, if they're set up properly, have something to do with usage of a system or service. The idea is, if you've got the correct set of SLOs and you're meeting those SLOs, that should equate to having a happy customer or a happy user. If you don't, if they don't represent that very well, then you probably don't have the right set of SLOs yet. Setting and measuring SLOs is a key responsibility of SREs. SREs tend to be the ones that sort of own the, knowledge and wisdom about how to set up SLOs, what they are, and sharing that wisdom with everybody else in the organization, getting agreement, and orchestrating, establishing those SLOs as something that the whole organization will buy into. The most widely tracked, or in other words, the most popular kind of SLO, is availability. As I mentioned before, there are many kinds of reliability, but the one that tends to be the most important is availability, because if a system is not available, then other types of measures such as, response time, latency, error rates, and so on don't really matter if the system's not available at all. So availability is almost always at least one of the SLOs for any particular service or capability that you want to manage to. So products and services generally will have multiple SLOs. It's pretty hard to characterize whether or not a client is happy just based on a single SLO. Availability alone is generally not enough to make a client available. If they're also going to want to have other things like, does it work? Is it reliable? Does it have errors? Does it keep up to date? And, is the data fresh and current when you get into a system? Things of that nature also may be very important to the client's experience depending on what the service is. So again, just in summary, in general, SLOs are all about making the user experience satisfactory and in general, better than than if you didn't have SLOs. It gives you something that very specific and objective to manage to. This is a quote from Ben McCormick. He was VP of Operations at Evernote. Pretty consistent with the messages in this course. Of course, before getting into the technical details of what an SLO is and how to use them and what to do to set them up, it's important to start a conversation from your customer's point of view. What promises are you trying to uphold? So this is related to the service level agreements, but your SLO should back up whatever those agreements are. Again, whether that customer is an internal user, stakeholder, or an end customer, that's usually the best place to start a conversation around what should our SLOs be. Here's an example. And I think this is actually the most important slide in the whole course, frankly, because this is, SLOs is the most important idea. And this slide is almost in a nutshell explains the whole idea of SLOs if you watch it carefully. So the diagram on the right represents, in effect, a series of service level agreements and objectives associated with those for a service. So there may be, let's take the top blue line. Maybe your service level agreement requires that the service is available 70% of the time. And so your SLO may be set at a higher level, maybe 80% of the time, just to give yourself some room if there's a failure that you're not going to breach your SLA. Bearing in mind that SLAs are often legal agreements, there may be some financial consequences if you don't meet your SLA. So SLOs are internal objectives, and you definitely want to set your internal objectives in such a manner that you're, less likely to breach your legal external commitments. So that's an explanation of that one line. And the other lines may be other, agreements, maybe not only availability, but the error rates you may commit to a level of, let's say, 75%. Maybe the data is going to, once you get into a system, maybe the data is going to be fresh at least 90% of the time. Maybe there's some other issues like latency, will hit a certain criteria 50% of the time. Sometimes these things are hard to get close to 100% because there are dependent services that prevent you from making a commitment. Let's say you have a service that works over the internet. You can't guarantee the performance of the internet all the time. That's really in the domain of the customer or other service providers. So you may not want to overcommit on that one. These are just examples. Anyhow, the difference between the SLO number, again, let's go back to the top line. Let's say you set an SLO at 80%. Then, that's not 100%. So the difference between the SLO number and 100% is called your error budget. That's the degree to which you are, according to your own budget, allowed to fail and still be within success of your SLO targets. So this is the general idea, right? An SLO is what you manage to. You really put in systems, you engineer systems as a SRE to make sure that you always meet your SLOs. And if you don't, you have you're monitoring your error budgets. And if there's if there's something happens that you're not meeting it, then that triggers what's called an error budget policy that would cause some specific predefined work to occur that would improve your ability to meet those SLO targets in the future. So that's another factor. There's a time factor as well. You set SLOs to be time bound. Usually they're like, okay, we're going to meet these SLOs every month to be successful. So the very first bullet shows you an example of an SLO. If you had a web service, you could say they decided that 99.9% of the web requests from clients per month will be successful. That's an SLO. In other words, only 0.1% of the web requests in that month may fail, and still you'll consider that to be a success. Recall that there's no such thing as 100% reliability. It doesn't exist in nature. So, you don't want to try to set a goal that's not achievable. At some point it will fail. So you're trying to set a goal that makes sense, but most importantly, you're trying to set a goal or an objective that is going to be satisfactory to the customer. There's no point in setting a goal that's too difficult if the customer is happy with a much smaller number. So this is part of all your considerations as an SRE. So further along this example, the second bullet, it says, if there was 1 million web requests in a particular month, then 0.1% of those, in other words, 1,000 of those are allowed to fail. That's your error budget. And you're not going to worry about it if it's less than 1,000 fail in a month, because that is a budget, and the budget is meant to be a budget. It's allowed. On the other hand, failure to meet or hit your SLO must have consequences. So if more than 1,000 out of 1 million requests fail in a particular month, then some error budget policy kicks in. For example, you may have some remediation work to automate something or change something in order to reduce the chances of that happening again. So again, this is kind of the whole core idea of an SLO and error budgets and error budget policy. So we'll have a lot more examples in the rest of this module to further explain it. Okay, so here's another example. Let's say you had a service with a login rate of 1,000 per hour in a rolling month, or 744,000 per month, just doing the math. How many in a month if there's that many in an hour? So let's say you decided as an SRE that you want 99% of those logins every month to be successful. That's now your SLO. Do the math again. It equates to losing 7,444 logins in a month. So that is your error budget. 1% of 7,440. 744,000 is 7,440 logins per month. That's your error budget. If more than that number of logins are lost in a month, then you have so-called breached your error budget. You've missed your target. You've breached the error budget. So we use a thing called a service level indicator, which is hand in hand with an SLO, to tell you whether or not, how many logins you actually got in a month. So an indicator is literally a count. In this case, it's a count of successful logins. In other words, in a particular month, if your actuals were 726,560, that exceeds your error budget, right? Because it would have exceeded the error budget. Failure to hit an SLO must have consequences. In this case, you may have an error budget policy that says we're going to instigate a business protection period, preventing new releases. So this is a popular, fairly frequently used type of error budget policy where the SREs declare that an SLO error budget has been breached, and they determine, according to some negotiations, what the policy will be. And then quite often that policy will be, wait a minute, don't do any more releases, because new releases tend to disturb the reliability. So for a while, until we get something implemented or back on track somehow, then you're not going to allow new releases. So that's an important way to demonstrate that SREs have a lot of power. That power is implied and actually provided through this concept of SLOs and error budgets. Because these are pre-agreed actions, the SRE can invoke those actions across the organization pretty quickly once you have an error budget breach. Here's another kind of example. This one's related to support tickets. Let's say you have an SLO that says 75% of support tickets must be automated. That's an SLO. And that may again be over a period of, let's say, a month. It doesn't have to be a month, it's whatever makes sense, but in this case, a month. So if there are 1,000 new support tickets in a month, 25% of those are in your error budget. So 250 could still be handled manually. You would still satisfy your SLO. If more than 250 or more than 25% required manual work, then that's, breaching your air budget, and that would cause the air budget policy to kick in. So this case, maybe the policy would say, well, we need to do some more engineering work, possibly collaborating with development to figure out how can we automate some more of those tickets, so that next month we get back on track. So that's another example of how SLOs and air budget policies work.